Kurt Kaminski thought his life was steady, a thriving business, a long marriage, and a bright future with his family. But when he uncovers his wife Jenna's betrayal with his closest friend, his world shatters. Fueled by anger, Kurt embarks on a path of revenge, severing ties and reclaiming his dignity. Yet just as he begins to rebuild, a sudden tragedy strikes, leaving him to grapple with loss, regret, and the realization that some wounds cut deeper than betrayal. In this gripping tale of love, vengeance, and heartbreak, Kurt learns the ultimate cost of trust broken and lives forever changed. The sun had long set by the time I arrived home, the weight of the day pressing heavily on my shoulders. The gleaming showroom floor at my dealership had been unusually quiet, leaving me more time than I wanted to dwell on the cracks forming in my marriage. Jenna and I had been together for 14 years, good years, or so I thought. Lately, though, things had changed. She wasn't the same woman I married. It wasn't the subtle shifts that come with time, the mellowing of passions or the routine of married life. No, this was something deeper, something that unsettled me to my core. Her laughter, once spontaneous and infectious, now felt rehearsed. The light in her eyes when she looked at me had dimmed, replaced by something I couldn't quite place. It had all started a few months ago, when Jenna began staying late at work more often than not. She worked at the university bookstore, a job she claimed gave her a sense of purpose. I supported her when she decided to go part-time, figuring it was a way for her to find balance. But lately, the balance seemed off. Nights at the bookstore turned into unexplained absences. When I'd ask, she'd say things like, "I got caught up," or, "It's just work, Kurt." The excuses sounded thin, but I told myself not to overthink it. After all, Jenna wasn't the type. At least, that's what I believed until that night. I was sitting in the garage, detailing the Mustang I'd been restoring for years. The hum of the buffer and the familiar scent of engine oil were a welcome distraction. My phone buzzed on the workbench, a rare interruption during my evening routine. It was a notification from Jenna's tablet. I had offered to update her software earlier that day, and she'd forgotten to change her password back afterward. Normally, I wouldn't have snooped, but the message caught my attention immediately. "George says he's looking forward to next time." My heart stopped. George. My best friend. The man who had stood beside me at my wedding. The man I trusted implicitly. I stared at the screen, replaying the words in my head. The message could have been innocent, but the intimacy of it gnawed at me. Next time. The phrase stuck like a thorn. Without giving myself time to second-guess, I opened the messaging app. The thread was sparse, and most of the texts were innocuous. But there was a pattern, a warmth and familiarity that didn't sit right. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach as I scrolled back through weeks of messages. Nothing outright damning, but enough to plant the seeds of doubt. George and Jenna had been talking more than I realized, about things that had nothing to do with me. I put the tablet down and stepped away, my hands trembling. The Mustang gleamed under the fluorescent lights, but I barely noticed. Memories of George's jokes flashed through my mind, the Polish jabs he loved to throw my way, the playful ribbing about how lucky I was to have Jenna. Had they always been this sharp, this targeted? Or was I only now seeing them for what they were? When Jenna came home that night, I watched her carefully. She moved through the house with an air of ease, humming a tune under her breath as she hung up her coat. She didn't look like someone carrying the weight of guilt. Maybe I was reading too much into things. Maybe I was losing my mind. Long day? I asked casually, leaning against the kitchen counter as she poured herself a glass of wine. Exhausting, she replied with a tired smile. Inventory's coming up, so we're prepping for that. How about you? Same old, I said, studying her. If she sensed my scrutiny, she didn't show it. We went through the motions of our evening routine, dinner, a few episodes of a show we'd been watching, then off to bed. Jenna fell asleep almost instantly, her breathing soft and even. I, on the other hand, stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. The next morning, I made a decision. I needed clarity, and if Jenna wasn't going to give it to me, I'd find it myself. A quick internet search later, I had a plan. By the time Jenna left for work, I was already downloading tracking software onto her phone. It wasn't something I was proud of, but I couldn't live with the uncertainty. The first few days were uneventful. Jenna's phone showed her at the bookstore during her shifts, at the grocery store afterward, and back home by evening. I started to feel foolish, like I'd let my insecurities get the better of me. But just as I was about to delete the app, her routine changed. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I noticed it. Instead of heading home after her shift, Jenna's phone pinged at a small cafe on the other side of town. I stared at the screen, willing the dots to connect. The cafe was in the same neighborhood where George lived. I waited until Jenna came home that night, her demeanor as cheerful as ever. She kissed me on the cheek, asked about my day, and made small talk over dinner. I tried to act normal, but the knot in my stomach tightened with every passing minute. "What did you do after work today?" I asked casually. "Nothing much," she said, not meeting my eyes. "Ran some errands." "Why?" "No reason. Just curious." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I knew she was lying, and she knew I wasn't convinced. Yet neither of us said anything more. The silence between us felt heavier than ever. That night, as Jenna slept soundly beside me, I lay awake once more. The tablet buzzed again, and I reached for it. This time, the message was from George himself. "Tonight was amazing. Can't wait to see you again." I stared at the screen, the words blurring as anger and hurt welled up inside me. There was no denying it now. Jenna and George were more than friends. My hands trembled as I set the tablet down. I needed to confront them, but not yet. Not until I had a plan. In the garage, the Mustang gleamed under the fluorescent lights, its polished exterior a sharp contrast to the storm brewing inside me. I ran my hand over the hood, the metal cool against my palm. This car had been a labor of love, a symbol of hard work and dedication. It deserved better than to sit idly in the chaos my life had become. And so did I. The Mustang sat in the garage, pristine and silent. It was my sanctuary, my safe space, but even it couldn't shield me from the weight of what I now knew. Jenna's betrayal wasn't just a possibility anymore, it was a reality. The text from George had burned itself into my brain, and though I wanted to confront them immediately, something held me back. I needed a plan. I spent the next morning pretending everything was fine. Jenna moved through her routine effortlessly, the image of a perfect wife. She kissed me goodbye before heading out the door, leaving behind the faint scent of her perfume. As soon as she was gone, I grabbed my laptop and began digging deeper. I wasn't just looking for more evidence, I was building my case. First, I combed through our financial records. I'd never paid much attention to Jenna's spending before, she'd always been responsible, and we had separate accounts for personal use. But now, every dollar spent felt like a clue. It didn't take long to find something suspicious, multiple charges from a boutique hotel on the outskirts of town. The dates coincided with the nights she claimed to be working late. Next, I reviewed her social media. Jenna wasn't an avid poster, but her Instagram told a different story. Pictures of coffee cups and scenic views, all tagged at locations she'd never mentioned to me. One, in particular, stood out, a shot of her hand resting on a cafe table. The reflection in the glass window showed a familiar figure across from her, George. I clenched my fists, my heart pounding in my chest. The betrayal wasn't just in their actions, it was in the ease with which they'd hidden it. They thought I was too blind, too trusting, to notice. But now, I noticed everything. The final piece of the puzzle came that evening. Jenna's tracker showed her leaving work and heading back to the same cafe. I watched the little dot on my screen, my stomach churning with a mixture of dread and determination. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. When she came home that night, I was ready. But instead of exploding with anger, I forced myself to remain calm. This wasn't the time for a confrontation, it was the time for strategy. "Hey," she said, her voice warm but tired. "How was your day?" "Same as always," I replied, my tone deliberately neutral. "How about yours?" "Busy," she said, avoiding my gaze. "You know how it is." I nodded, biting back the urge to call her out then and there. Instead, I changed the subject, steering the conversation toward mundane topics. If she suspected anything, she didn't show it. Over the next few days, I continued gathering evidence. Every receipt, every text, every location ping, I documented it all. I wanted to be sure there was no room for doubt when the time came. It wasn't just about proving her infidelity, it was about protecting myself. If Jenna and George thought they could humiliate me, they were sorely mistaken. On Friday, Jenna announced she'd be working late again. I smiled and kissed her goodbye, wishing her a good evening. As soon as she left, I followed her tracker. Sure enough, she wasn't headed to work. This time, she went straight to George's house. I parked a few blocks away, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The house was dark except for a single light in the living room. I sat there for what felt like hours, watching and waiting. My imagination ran wild with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Finally, the light went out, and Jenna emerged from the house, her hair slightly disheveled. I stayed in the car, my emotions a whirlwind of anger, sadness, and determination. Watching her walk back to her car, I knew the time had come. I couldn't let this go on any longer. But confronting her wasn't enough, I needed to make sure George felt the consequences too. The next morning, I went to my dealership as usual. George was already there, working on one of the cars in the shop. He greeted me with his usual grin, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. "Morning, boss," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Got the Mustang running yet?" "Not yet," I replied, forcing a smile. "But soon." We chatted briefly about work, but I couldn't bring myself to look him in the eye. The thought of him with Jenna made my skin crawl, but I kept my composure. This wasn't the place for a confrontation. I had something better in mind. Later that afternoon, I called George into my office. He looked confused but didn't question it. As soon as the door closed behind him, I turned to face him. "We need to talk," I said, my voice low and steady. "Sure, what's up?" he asked, leaning casually against the desk. I stared at him, searching for any sign of remorse or guilt. If it was there, he hid it well. "I know about you and Jenna," I said, watching his reaction carefully. For a moment, his face went pale, but he quickly recovered, forcing a laugh. "What are you talking about, Kurt?" "Don't play dumb," I snapped, my patience wearing thin. "I've seen the texts. I've tracked her to your house. Don't insult me by pretending it's not true." He opened his mouth to respond but stopped, his confidence faltering. I took a step closer, my fists clenched at my sides. "You've been my friend for years," I continued, my voice shaking with anger. "I trusted you, George. And you repaid me by sleeping with my wife." "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. It just did." "Save your excuses," I said, cutting him off. "You've made your choices, and now you'll face the consequences." I handed him an envelope containing his termination papers. "You're done here. Effective immediately." "Kurt, come on," he said, his tone pleading. "Don't do this." "It's already done," I replied coldly. "Get out." George hesitated for a moment, then nodded and left without another word. As the door closed behind him, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. He had been my friend, but now he was nothing more than a painful memory. That evening, I waited for Jenna to come home. I had no doubt she'd heard from George by now, but I didn't care. I was ready to face her, ready to put an end to the charade. As I sat in the kitchen, the Mustang gleaming in the garage behind me, I knew this was only the beginning. Jenna walked through the door just past 8, her usual air of calm intact. She carried a bag of groceries in one hand, her purse slung over her shoulder. For a moment, I wondered how she managed to maintain such composure when everything around her was falling apart. She glanced at me, her smile faint but polite. "Hey," she said, setting the groceries on the counter. "How was your day?" I stared at her, the weight of the confrontation pressing down on me like a storm cloud. This was it. There was no turning back now. "It was enlightening," I said, my voice sharp enough to cut through the silence. Jenna paused, her hand halfway to her purse. Her eyes flicked to mine, and for the first time in weeks, I saw a crack in her facade. "What do you mean?" I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms across my chest. "I had a conversation with George today." Her face froze, the blood draining from her cheeks. "Oh." I let the word hang in the air for a moment, savoring the shift in power. "Yes, oh. Care to guess what we talked about?" "Kurt," she began, her voice shaky, "I can explain." "Don't bother," I interrupted, standing up. "I've seen the texts, Jenna. I've tracked your phone. I know about the hotel charges, the late nights, the time you've spent at his house. So don't insult me by pretending this is something you can explain away." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She stood there, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. For the first time, she looked vulnerable, small. Part of me wanted to feel pity, but the anger roaring inside me left no room for compassion. "How long?" I demanded, my voice rising. "How long has this been going on?" She lowered her gaze, her hands trembling. "A few months." "A few months?" I laughed bitterly, pacing the kitchen. "And you thought I wouldn't notice? You thought I wouldn't figure it out?" "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said softly, her voice barely audible. It just did." "That's the best you can come up with?" I asked, my voice dripping with contempt. "You didn't mean for it to happen. You just fell into bed with my best friend by accident." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't care. She could cry all she wanted, it wouldn't erase the betrayal. It wouldn't undo the damage she'd done. "Kurt, please," she said, taking a step toward me. "I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. But it doesn't mean I don't love you." I held up a hand, stopping her in her tracks. Don't you dare say you love me. You don't get to use that word after what you've done." She flinched, her tears spilling over. "I know I've hurt you, but I want to fix this. I want to make it right." I shook my head, the bitterness in my chest growing stronger. "You don't get to decide that, Jenna. You made your choice. And now I'm making mine." "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It means we're done," I said, my words final and unyielding. "I've already spoken to a lawyer. The divorce papers will be ready soon." Her eyes widened, the color draining from her face. "No, Kurt, please. Don't do this. We can work through this. I'll do anything." "You had your chance to make this work," I said, my voice cold. "You chose to throw it away for some fling with George. That's on you, not me." She broke down then, collapsing into a chair as sobs racked her body. I watched her, unmoved. The sight of her tears only served to reinforce my resolve. This wasn't a woman fighting for our marriage, this was a woman mourning the loss of her control. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her to her misery. Upstairs, I closed the bedroom door behind me, the sound of her cries muffled by the walls. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. It was over. The lies, the betrayal, the doubt, they all ended here. The next day, I called my lawyer and finalized the details of the divorce. Jenna tried to talk to me, begged me to reconsider, but I refused to listen. I was done playing the fool. As I packed my things, I couldn't help but reflect on the years we'd spent together. The good times, the laughter, the love, it all felt like a distant memory now. I had built a life with Jenna, only to watch her tear it apart piece by piece. But I wasn't going to let her or George destroy me. I was stronger than that. And as I loaded the last of my belongings into the Mustang, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a new one. I started the engine, the familiar rumble filling the garage. As I backed out of the driveway, I glanced at the house one last time. Jenna stood at the window, her face pale and tear-streaked. For a moment, I felt a pang of sadness. But it was fleeting. I drove away without looking back. The Mustang roared down the open highway, the horizon stretching endlessly before me. Freedom, I thought. Finally, freedom. The wind rushed through the windows, carrying away the weight of the past few weeks. Yet as the miles ticked by, an unfamiliar emptiness began to settle in my chest. I had left everything behind, Jenna, the betrayal, the suffocating lies. I should have felt relief, even vindication. But instead, a strange hollowness gnawed at me. The betrayal hadn't just shattered our marriage, it had shattered me. I pulled into a roadside diner somewhere off the interstate. The smell of coffee and fried food greeted me as I slid into a booth near the window. The waitress, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes, poured me a cup of coffee without a word. I stared into the dark liquid, my reflection rippling with every small tremor of the table. I reached for my phone, scrolling through messages I had no intention of answering. Most were from Jenna. Pleas for forgiveness, for one last chance. I had ignored every one of them, deleting them without response. But one message, sent only hours ago, stopped me cold. Kurt, I know you hate me. I don't blame you. But please, come back. I need to talk to you. It's important. I set the phone down, my appetite gone. What could she possibly say that I hadn't already heard? Another excuse. Another attempt to shift the blame. I shook my head, dismissing the thought. There was no going back. As I paid the bill and walked back to the Mustang, the words lingered in my mind. It's important. What if it wasn't about us? What if it was about something else, something more? The thought unsettled me, and against my better judgment, I decided to call her. The phone rang several times before her voice, soft and broken, answered. Kurt, she said, her breath hitching. What is it, Jenna? I asked, my voice devoid of emotion. There was a pause, a silence so heavy it felt like it might crush me. I didn't want to tell you this over the phone, but I don't have a choice. Then don't, I said flatly. I don't care anymore, Jenna. Her voice cracked. It's not about us, Kurt. It's about Carrie. The mention of our daughter's name sent a chill through me. What about her? She's in the hospital, Jenna said, her words barely audible. There was an accident. My heart stopped. What happened? She was hit by a car while walking home from school. Kurt, I didn't know how to reach you. I've been calling for hours. My grip on the phone tightened as a wave of panic and guilt washed over me. Is she okay? She's in critical condition, Jenna said, her voice breaking completely. They're saying it doesn't look good. The world around me seemed to tilt, the edges of my vision blurring. Without a word, I ended the call, climbed into the Mustang, and hit the gas. The tires screeched as I tore out of the parking lot, the engine roaring in protest. The drive back to town was a blur of headlights and pavement, my mind racing faster than the car. Every memory of Carrie flashed before me, her first steps, her first words, the way she'd laugh uncontrollably at the dumb jokes I told. How had I let my anger and pride blind me to what truly mattered? By the time I reached the hospital, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I ran inside, ignoring the looks from the staff, and found Jenna sitting in the waiting room. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen from crying. She looked up at me, and for the first time in weeks, I saw nothing but raw, unfiltered pain. "They're in there with her now," she whispered, pointing toward the intensive care unit. I pushed past her and into the ICU. The sight of Carrie, small and fragile amidst the tangle of tubes and monitors, stole the breath from my lungs. Her face was bruised, her head wrapped in bandages. She looked so still, so lifeless. The steady beep of the heart monitor was the only sign that she was still with us. A doctor approached, his expression grave. "Mr. Kaminsky?" "Yes," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We're doing everything we can, but her injuries are severe. You should prepare yourselves for the worst." The words hit me like a sledgehammer, and I sank into the chair beside Carrie's bed. Jenna entered the room quietly, standing on the opposite side of the bed. For a moment, we said nothing, our shared grief too overwhelming for words. Hours passed, the beeping of the monitor a cruel metronome ticking away what little time we had left. I reached out and took Carrie's hand in mine, her skin cold beneath my touch. "Hey, kiddo," I said, my voice cracking. "It's Dad. I'm here." Jenna sobbed quietly, her shoulders shaking. I wanted to comfort her, to say something to ease her pain, but I couldn't. All I could do was sit there, helpless, as the world around me fell apart. As dawn broke, the beeping of the monitor slowed, each sound further apart than the last. The doctor returned, his face etched with sorrow. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "She's gone." The words echoed in my mind, hollow and meaningless. Gone. My daughter was gone. Jenna collapsed into a chair, her cries filling the room. I sat there in silence, numb to everything except the crushing weight of loss. In the days that followed, I moved through life like a ghost, the pain of losing Carrie overshadowing everything else. Jenna and I barely spoke, our shared grief too heavy a burden to bear. The divorce papers remained unsigned, forgotten in the chaos. The Mustang sat untouched in the garage, a symbol of a life that no longer felt like my own. I had thought leaving Jenna would set me free, but freedom meant nothing without the people who mattered most. In the end, the betrayal, the revenge, the anger, it all seemed so small compared to the tragedy that had stolen my daughter. I had lost everything that truly mattered, and there was no going back.